Story 1. The deep dark watch. The perpetual night of the Alaskan high Arctic had fallen upon Outpost 7, settling over the Brooks Range like a shroud of frozen iron. Elias Vance, the outpost's lone caretaker, measured his existence not by days, but by the dwindling fuel gauge and the relentless tick of the atomic clock. He was a man running from his past, seeking the deepest, coldest silence the earth offered. Now, the silence had begun to speak. The outpost was a relic. A rugged, half-buried steel hut, 300 miles from the nearest semblance of civilization. 4 days ago, the ghost storm had annihilated his satellite link, leaving behind a silence so dense it pressed against the eardrums, a solid vacuum where all sound went to die. The temperature was a stable, murderous -62 degrees Fahrenheit. The first sign of the intrusion was entirely wrong. Elias was checking the main fuel drum, bundled in his extreme cold weather gear, the only noise his snowshoes crunching on the dry, crystalline powder. The ground was flawless, save for his own tracks, until he saw them, 30 yards from the rear wall, in the shelter of a massive snowdrift. They were tracks that mocked the anatomy of man and beast. Impossibly long, naked-looking human feet, but flattened and compressed, suggesting a stride that spanned meters with negligible effort. Most chillingly, the prints were shallow, as if whatever made them was light, almost spectral, defying the sheer mass required to cover that distance. Elias backed away, the panic cold and sharp in his chest. A bear hibernates. Wolves travel in packs. This was solitary, silent, and entirely new to the taxonomy of fear. The following day, the tracks were bolder. They circled the perimeter of the hut, sometimes vanishing entirely where the creature appeared to have simply glided over crevasses, only to reappear precisely beneath the small, frosted window of Elias's sleeping quarters. It was watching him. It knew where he was. He triple-locked the heavy magnetic latches on the airlock and checked his rifle, an ancient, reliable 30-06 with a precious 20 rounds. That evening, the hallucinations began, fueled by the isolation and the terror. The heavy, cold ache returned to the base of his skull, the classic feeling of being watched. Then came the sound. A scraping, rhythmic noise against the corrugated steel of the outer wall, like stone grinding stone. It evolved into a whisper, so faint it could have been the shifting ice in his inner ear, yet perfectly articulated. It was his own voice, worn thin and raw by solitude. "Elias, you look so cold." He pressed his palms against his ears, teeth grinding. No voices. Only the wind. Then, the voice shifted. It deepened, becoming heavier, wetter, and infused with a desperate, cavernous emptiness. "I'm the last man, Elias. Don't you want to talk to the last man?" Elias realized with sickening clarity that the creature wasn't just mimicking sound. It was mimicking loneliness. It was trying to use his own profound isolation as a tool to gain entry, eroding the fragile wall between his sanity and the absolute emptiness outside. He spent the rest of the night rigid on his cot, the rifle across his knees, staring at the ceiling. The airlock door shuddered occasionally, but he convinced himself it was just the expansion and contraction of the steel. On the third night of the watch, the creature escalated its tactics. The whispering stopped entirely, replaced by a dull, methodical thudding against the west wall, near the external fuel drum. Thud. Thud. Pause. Thud. Thud. Pause. It was the sound of something immensely heavy and wet repeatedly striking metal. Elias scraped a small hole in the frost on the kitchen window with his pocket knife. The aurora was out, painting the snow in violent, chaotic greens that made the shadows dance. He saw it. It was impossibly tall, bent at the waist, its height magnified by the low perspective and the shifting light. It wasn't covered in fur. Its body was a sickening gray, taut over an unnatural skeletal structure that seemed to have too many joints. Its limbs were too long, its hands drooping past its knees. It looked less like an animal and more like a human body stretched and cured in the relentless cold. It had turned its head toward him, though Elias could see no eyes in the long, narrow skull, only deep, lightless sockets. The thing wasn't hitting the drum. It was standing beside the drum, beating its fists rhythmically against the dense air near the metal, creating a sonic pattern to distract him. It was intelligent. As Elias watched, the creature paused its drumming, lifted its impossibly long right arm, and deliberately pointed toward the roof. Then, with an ear-splitting shriek of torn steel, the generator vent, the weakest point of the hut's superstructure, was ripped open. The creature hadn't been attacking the drum. It was staging a feint while it scaled the high snowdrift behind the hut. It was in the process of entering. A long, pale hand, ending in black, razor-like nails, dropped into the hut through the ruptured vent above the kitchen. The hand gripped the copper piping of the main gas heater and crushed it, spraying highly pressurized fuel vapor into the sealed space. Elias screamed, recognizing the immediate danger. A spark from the generator's ancient wiring, or even the friction of a light switch, would turn the hut into a bomb. The main valve to shut off the gas flow was outside, next to the fuel drum. He didn't hesitate. He seized the rifle, threw open the airlock, and lunged into the lethal cold. The blast of -60 degrees hit him like a physical punch, stealing his breath. He scrambled through the snow, running for the valve. He heard the metallic groan behind him as the creature ripped the airlock door clear off its hinges, tossing the heavy steel panel aside like plywood. He reached the valve, his fingers already stiffening, and wrenched the thick wheel shut. The hiss of the gas from the hut died instantly. He turned, the .30-06 trembling in his grip, aimed at the entrance. The creature didn't rush him. It stood silhouetted against the dark opening, its body unnervingly still. Its long, mandibular jaw opened, revealing a black throat, but no teeth. The sound that emerged was not a growl, but a noise of bottomless sorrow. It was the sound of a woman weeping, a sound so utterly human and agonizing it spoke of generations of loss and starvation. Elias fired. The bullet struck the gray slate of the creature's chest. The rifle report was immense but immediately swallowed by the Arctic void. The creature didn't bleed. It only seemed to stagger, a piece of its outer layer flaking off to reveal something harder, like bleached bone or mineral beneath. The weeping vanished, replaced by a low, guttural hiss of pure, frustrated malice. Elias knew the battle was lost. The gun was useless. This thing was not flesh. It was a hungry, sentient artifact of the cold. He turned his back on the outpost and ran, not toward the useless hope of Utqiagvik, but toward the one point of potential rescue, the decommissioned FAA emergency beacon on Eagle Peak, 50 miles away. The ghost miles the run quickly devolved into a crawl, and the crawl into a brutal, agonizing stagger. Elias shed his heavy rifle. The weight was killing him, keeping only his sidearm, a flare gun, and a small pack containing dried caribou jerky and a block of pemmican. The creature, which he mentally named the Deep Watcher, did not pursue him in a conventional sense. It stalked. When Elias paused, shivering uncontrollably beneath the unstable green light of the aurora, he would hear the faint, scraping sound a mile back. When he tried to rest in a shallow ice cave, he would hear a whisper, impossibly close, yet too thin to be real. "You can't warm your bones with lies, Elias." The cold was the Watcher's ally. It infiltrated his gear, finding every weak seam, every exposed patch of skin. His mind, deprived of sleep and the stimulation of light, began to betray him. On the second day of the traverse, a blinding white sun rose over the horizon. Elias cried with relief, falling to his knees and weeping at the sight of the life-giving light. He stripped off his hood, bathing his face in the glorious, warm photons. Then, the reality snapped back. The real sun wouldn't return for months. The light was a trick, a perfect, blinding, silent whiteout engineered by the Deep Watcher. As the false sun intensified, Elias felt his skin begin to burn, not from heat, but from the brutal exposure. The light was not warmth. It was a psychological weapon designed to strip him of his survival instinct. He quickly pulled his hood back up, shutting his eyes against the searing, phantom rays. When he opened them again, the false sun was gone, replaced by the chaotic, eternal dark. He saw the Watcher then, a long, black shadow flitting between two granite tors, its head titled, watching him recover from the cruelest joke imaginable. His survival became an exercise in refusing to think. He focused on the next footfall, the next frozen breath, the next inch of vertical gain toward Eagle Peak. The final ascent. Elias reached Eagle Peak on the morning of the fourth day. He found the FAA shack, a corrugated tin box bolted onto the rock face, buried under 20 years of ice. The main access door was sealed shut, the handle frozen solid in a block of blue ice. He used the last of his energy to shatter the ice with a heavy pry bar he found nearby. He crawled inside, slamming the heavy door shut, sealing the tin box around him. The shack was worse than Outpost 7. It had no heat, but it had a functional, albeit dusty, emergency beacon transmitter. He found the schematic taped to the wall. The unit required power from a bank of heavy-duty marine batteries. The battery bank was dead. Elias tore through the shack, his movements frantic. He needed power. He found one last supply. A jerrycan of high-octane maintenance fuel, enough for perhaps 10 minutes of emergency transmission. The transmitter had a small, manual crank generator backup, but only to boost a signal, not to start the unit cold. He knew what he had to do. He dragged the batteries outside, pouring the flammable fuel over them, readying the pyre. He would use the brief warmth of the resulting fire to crack the frozen circuits, use the generator to power the beacon, and then use the subsequent smoke and heat as a signal. He turned back toward the door to retrieve the transmitter. The Deep Watcher was standing in the doorway. It was not a shadow here. It was solid, heavy, and covered in a thin dusting of snow that melted instantly where it touched the ground. It had found his place of final refuge. The creature didn't move, but the air in the small shack dropped 10 degrees instantly, freezing the condensation on Elias's breath. "You ran 50 miles to a dead machine, Elias," the wet, agonizing whisper returned, coming not from the mouth, but seeming to vibrate in the floor and the walls. "You wasted your warmth. Now you're cold, and I'm ready." Elias raised his sidearm, a heavy revolver, and leveled it at the creature's chest. "You're hungry," he choked out, his throat raw. "But you're not hungry for my flesh. You're hungry for my will." He understood now. This was not a predator. It was a psychological mechanism, a monster born of the Arctic's desire to reclaim the life that dared to violate its silence. It fed on the final surrender of hope, the moment a man stopped fighting and allowed the cold to take him. The Watcher took a single, unnaturally slow step forward, its hand reaching out. Elias dropped the gun. He snatched the flare gun from his belt and, with a final, desperate roar that defied the silence of the Arctic, he fired the flare directly into the jerrycan of fuel next to the shack. A flash of orange-white light instantly erupted into a blinding, roaring column of fire. The heat hit the creature like a physical wall, driving it back with a hissing sound like superheated steam. The explosion bought Elias 10 seconds. He lunged back into the shack, grabbed the still frozen transmitter, and plunged it into the intense heat of the inferno. He cranked the manual generator, forcing the system to come alive while the intense heat cracked the circuits. The Watcher was retreating, melting backward into the snow, its long body contorting. It could not endure the light or the warmth, the very things it used to torture him. But its voice, that terrible sound of deep, feminine grief, shrieked into the wind. You cannot escape. You will return to me. The fire raged, throwing a column of black smoke high into the black, windless sky. The shack's antenna, warmed by the blaze, began to hum. Elias cranked the generator until his arms seized up, the sound of the signal pulsing out into the void. He collapsed beside the burning fuel, his body overheating, his face raw from the cold and the subsequent heat. He watched the Deep Watcher shrink away into the endless night, a retreating shadow promising a return. Elias Vance was safe, for now. He was warm, momentarily. But he was also sitting in the middle of the Brooks Range, his shelter destroyed, his past caught up to him, and the entire Arctic night now knowing precisely where he was. He knew the creature would not give up. It would wait for the fire to die, for the signal to cease, for the exhaustion to set in. It would wait for him to choose silence again. He closed his eyes, listening to the roar of the fire and the insistent, fragile pulse of the FAA beacon, the only sounds left in a world that had tried to claim him for the deep dark watch. He was alive, but the horror was that the Alaskan night was infinite, and it had learned his name. Story 2. The perpetual night of the Alaskan high Arctic had long been Elias Vance's refuge, a willing exile he chose after his life imploded thousands of miles south. He measured his existence at Outpost 7 by the relentless, cold logic of the atomic clock and the slow descent of the fuel gauge. He was a man running from betrayal and disgrace, seeking the deepest, coldest silence the earth offered. 4 days ago, the ghost storm, a violent blizzard that crippled all satellite communication, had left behind a silence so dense it pressed against his eardrums, and now, that silence had begun to speak. The outpost, a rugged, half-buried steel hut, was 300 miles from anything resembling civilization. Elias clung to routine as a last fortress of the mind, meticulously logging temperatures and checking the outer perimeter. It was on one of these checks, bundled in extreme cold weather gear, that he found the anomaly that shattered his fragile control. The snow was crystalline, untouched save for the methodical crush of his own snowshoes, until he reached the shelter of a massive snowdrift 30 yards from the rear wall. There, mocking the known laws of biomechanics, were the tracks. Impossibly long, flattened, and compressed, they suggested a colossal human footprint, yet fundamentally alien. The stride spanned meters, yet the impressions in the dry, crystalline powder were shallow, almost spectral, as if the immense weight required to cover that distance was somehow negated. It was solitary, silent, and new to the taxonomy of fear. Elias backed away slowly, the fear cold and sharp, settling deep in his bones. He triple-locked the heavy magnetic latches on the airlock and loaded his reliable .30-06 rifle. He told himself it was a mutated moose, or a polar bear on its hind legs, but the tracks returned the next morning, bolder and more deliberate. They had circled the perimeter, vanishing only to reappear precisely beneath the small, frosted window of his sleeping quarters. It was watching him. The psychological assault began that evening. First, the heavy, cold ache at the base of his skull, the classic feeling of being observed. Then came the sound. A scraping, rhythmic noise against the corrugated steel of the outer wall, like stone grinding stone. It evolved into a whisper, so faint it could have been the shifting ice in his inner ear, yet perfectly articulated in his own voice, worn thin and raw by months of solitude. Elias, you look so cold. Just let me in for a moment of warmth. He pressed his palms against his ears, fighting the urge to shout back. When he lowered his hands, the voice had shifted, deepening, becoming wetter, infused with a desperate, cavernous emptiness. I'm the last man, Elias. Don't you want to talk to the last man? I'm so hungry, Elias. He realized with sickening clarity that the creature wasn't just mimicking sound. It was weaponizing his own profound loneliness. It was trying to erode the fragile wall between his sanity and the absolute emptiness outside. On the third night of the watch, the whispering stopped. It was replaced by a dull, methodical thudding against the west wall, near the external fuel drum. Thud, thud, pause, thud, thud, pause. Elias peered through a scraped hole in the frost on the kitchen window. The aurora painted the snow in violent, chaotic greens that made the shadows dance. He saw it, impossibly tall, bent at the waist, its body a sickening gray, taut over an unnatural skeletal structure. It looked like a human body stretched and cured in the cold, lacking any discernible eyes, just deep, lightless sockets. It wasn't hitting the drum. It was standing beside the drum, beating its fists against the dense air near the metal. It was a feint. As he watched, the creature paused, lifted its impossibly long arm, and deliberately pointed toward the roof vent. A shriek of torn steel erupted overhead. The generator vent, the weakest point of the hut's superstructure, was ripped open. A long, pale hand, ending in black, razor-like nails, dropped through the rupture above the kitchen. The hand gripped the copper piping of the main gas heater and crushed it, spraying highly pressurized fuel vapor into the sealed space. Elias screamed. The gas-air mixture was a volatile bomb. The main valve to shut off the flow was outside, next to the fuel drum. He seized the rifle, threw open the airlock, and lunged into the lethal cold. The blast of -60 degrees stole his breath. He scrambled for the valve, hearing the metallic groan behind him as the creature ripped the heavy steel airlock door completely off its hinges. He wrenched the thick wheel shut. The hiss died. He turned, the 3006 trembling. The creature stood silhouetted against the dark opening. Its long, mandibular jaw opened, and the sound that emerged was not a growl, but a sound of bottomless, feminine sorrow. It was the sound of utter, human defeat. Elias fired. The bullet struck the slate-gray skin. The creature didn't bleed. It only staggered, a piece of its outer layer flaking off to reveal something harder, like mineral or bone. The weeping vanished, replaced by a low, guttural hiss of pure malice. The rifle was useless. This thing was a hungry, sentient artifact of the cold. Elias turned his back on the outpost and ran, not toward civilization, but toward the one potential point of rescue, the decommissioned FAA emergency beacon on Eagle Peak, 50 miles away. The chase quickly devolved into a brutal stagger. Elias shed the heavy rifle, keeping only his sidearm, a flare gun, and a small pack. The creature, which he mentally named the Deep Watcher, did not rush him. It stalked, using the vastness and the weather as its greatest weapon. Whenever Elias paused to rest, the scraping would follow, or a whisper, impossibly close. You can't warm your bones with lies, Elias. The isolation was no longer just the setting, it was the weapon. On the second day, a blinding white sun rose over the horizon. Elias wept with relief, tearing off his hood to bathe in the warmth. Then, the sickening truth snapped back. The sun wouldn't return for months. The light was a trick, a cruel, blinding whiteout engineered by the Watcher to burn him psychologically. He scrambled to shield his eyes, collapsing in violent nausea. When he recovered, the false sun was gone, and the long, black shadow of the Watcher flitted away, having observed his moment of weakness. He reached Eagle Peak on the morning of the fourth day, finding the FAA shack, a tin box bolted onto the rock, buried under decades of ice. He shattered the frozen handle with a pry bar and crawled inside, immediately sealing the thin door. He located the emergency beacon transmitter, but its marine batteries were dead. He found one last supply, a jerrycan of high-octane maintenance fuel. The beacon had a manual crank generator backup, but it could only boost a signal, not start the system cold. He dragged the batteries outside, pouring the fuel over them. He would use the fire to crack the frozen circuits, use the generator to power the beacon, and the resulting smoke as a signal. He turned back toward the door to retrieve the transmitter. The Deep Watcher was standing in the doorway. It was solid, no longer a shadow. You ran 50 miles to a dead machine. Elias, the wet, agonizing whisper returned, vibrating in the metal floor. You wasted your warmth. Now you're cold, and I'm ready. Elias understood now. The creature didn't need his flesh. It was hungry for his will. It fed on the final, conscious surrender to the cold. The Watcher took a slow step forward, its hand reaching out. Elias dropped the useless sidearm, snatched the flare gun, and fired the flare directly into the jerrycan of fuel next to the shack. A flash of orange-white light instantly erupted into a column of roaring fire. The heat drove the Watcher back with a hiss like superheated steam. Elias plunged the frozen transmitter into the inferno, searing the casing. He cranked the manual generator, forcing the system to come alive while the intense heat cracked the circuits. The beacon began its rhythmic pulse, screaming into the void. The Watcher shrieked, 1,000 echoes of rage and grief, as it melted backward into the snow. It could not endure the light or the warmth, but its retreat was a promise of return. Elias survived the next 4 days on the peak through sheer, desperate obstinacy, cranking the generator until his muscles seized up. He refused to sleep, reciting scientific formulae and old memories, refusing to let his mind entertain the comfort of defeat. Outside the window, the Deep Watcher's trophies stood, the frozen bodies of past explorers, arranged in poses of final, agonizing surrender around the base of the peak. The Watcher was waiting for him to join its silent council. On the 5th day of the wait, the silence broke again. A low, resonant hum cut through the air. A distant engine. Rescue. Elias scrambled up, his adrenaline spiking, seeing a single point of light moving across the tundra below. He threw the door open, ready to signal. A massive wall of unnatural, polished black ice materialized in front of him. It was sheer, instantly formed, spanning the entire width of the access path leading up the peak. The Watcher had used the intense cold as a building tool, waiting until the very moment hope arrived to construct an impenetrable, frozen barrier. The light below stopped, confused by the sudden, massive obstacle. The Deep Watcher stood atop the ice barrier, illuminated by the searchlight far below. It spoke now in the clearest, calmest voice Elias had ever heard, the voice of a reasonable, calculating man. They heard you, Elias. But they cannot climb this. You must come to me. The Watcher wanted a witness. It wanted the final, devastating sight of Elias's surrender for the rescuers to discover. The rescue light, confused, began to turn, preparing to retreat and wait for the sun. Elias had minutes before he was utterly abandoned. He grabbed the heavy pry bar and the flare gun. He stumbled to the door and threw it open. The Watcher was there, its face inches from his, the long skull finally revealing a cruel, stretched grin. Elias didn't shoot the flare at the creature. He slammed the flare gun into the main receiver of the beacon transmitter and pulled the trigger. The flare fired down the antenna and into the sensitive core of the transmitter. There was a brief flash, ozone, and then silence. The beacon was annihilated. The signal was dead. The Watcher paused, its head tilted, confused by the destruction of the very thing Elias had fought for. He had robbed it of its final, public victory. You threw away your only chance. You are mine now. The creature shrieked, its voice splitting into 1,000 echoes of rage. Elias ignored it. He swung the pry bar, not at the creature, which was impervious, but at the ice wall below its feet. He struck the same spot repeatedly, his strength bolstered by a final, insane burst of defiance. With a groan that shook the peak, a massive slab of the brittle ice fractured and collapsed. The Deep Watcher, balanced atop its temporary creation, lost its footing and plunged into the resulting void. Elias heard the heavy, wet impact deep below. He slammed the door shut, collapsing, knowing he had chosen solitude and silence over surrender. He lay there, forcing his mind to work, refusing the cold sleep. Hours later, the high-pitched whine of a helicopter rotor blade sliced the air. The massive column of smoke he had created days ago, combined with the sudden death of the emergency beacon, had drawn a dedicated rescue operation. Elias was pulled from the shack by two men in heavy winter gear. As they carried him down on a stretcher, he looked back at Eagle Peak. The ice wall was still there. But at its base, where the Deep Watcher had fallen, the ice was cracked. Not shattered, but spider-webbed with fractures, and a thin, unsettling gray fluid was slowly oozing into the pristine snow. He was safe. He was warm. But as the helicopter lifted him away from the Brooks Range, the familiar, heavy ache returned to the base of his neck, the feeling of being watched. Elias knew the Deep Watcher was a creature of immense cold, a patient entity that needed the darkness and the silence to hunt. But he had forced it to move. He had chosen to live. The horror was that the Alaskan night had learned his name, learned his mind, and learned his weakness. The Watcher had merely retreated to warmer climes, and it was now waiting for the next long night, the one that would eventually descend on his mind, no matter where he ran. The cold sentinel was no longer confined to the Arctic, it had followed him home. Thank you so much for watching this video. Make sure to subscribe, like, comment and turn on notifications if you enjoyed the video so you never miss an upload.